Namaskar to all of you. In the last two sessions, we were discussing the background of the Semitic paradigm and some history. When you looked at the Semitic paradigm, we say that there are three major religions belonging to the same paradigm, but slightly differing in their outlook when it comes to practical implementation. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they have the same root. The importance of paradigm is that it is a paradigm, that is a worldview, that defines the purpose of life for somebody who accepts that paradigm. And with the purpose of life, the value system gets defined. With the value system, the culture gets formed. And people are generally born into this culture. They accept this value system. That means the paradigm, right from childhood. And rarely people question that. And when they question, it becomes a serious psychological issue for the person. It's called the identity crisis in psychology. And people find it very difficult to change their paradigm. It is a great psychological pain. There will be great emotional turmoil. So most people remain in the paradigm into which they are born. And in the context in which we are discussing this is the CAA Act. There have been a lot of controversy on that. So we are trying to understand the basis, the root of these controversies. There are three paradigms which are prominent in the world today. One is the Indian paradigm, another is the Semitic paradigm, and the third one is the materialist paradigm. Each one of them are trying to vie with each other to gain control over humanity, various nations, etc. In India too, this is a reality. So we are trying to understand that. In the last session, we looked at some historical developments. And the point of that session was that the paradigm defines their actions and behaviors. From outside, it may look that this is barbaric, this is wrong, this is atrocious, this is inhuman, etc. But for a person within that paradigm, it is fully justified. And what I am trying to say is that it is a paradigm that gets implemented through the community. We are continuing that session. During this session, we are going to look at our own history, our own experience, historical experience over several centuries. There were several invasions on our country. I'm leaving out the ancient invasions, but the recent invasions, that is 1,000 years old invasions. The first one was the Muhammad bin Qasim in 712 AD, who did not come to the mainland India, but he invaded Gandhar, Sindh, and returned. Then for 300 years, there was a lull. Then Muhammad Ghazni invaded. He came to the mainland India around 1000 AD. He made some 17 incursions, looted, and went back. The next invasion happened through Muhammad Ghori nearly 200 years later, that is 1191-92. He made several incursions starting from 86, but the major battle took place in 1191, and again in 92. In 91, he lost. He begged pardon Prithviraj Chauhan excused him and he went back. In the next year, he returned. And we have seen the letter which Prithviraj wrote, but the consequence after the war was terrible. He established what is known as the Ghori dynasty in Delhi. It lasted a few years, some 14 years. After that, it went to his slave, Qutbuddin Aibak. It is known as the Mamluk dynasty or the slave dynasty, which lasted some 90 years, 1206 to 1296. Following that, it was Khilji dynasty, and following that it was Lodi. And these 5 dynasties ruled from Delhi for nearly 334 years. Then came Babur, 1526. Babur established Mughal dynasty, and it lasted another 331 years. We normally divide this period into 2. One is from 1526 to 1707. That is until the beginning of Babur, ending with Aurangzeb's death. After Aurangzeb, 1707 to 1857, there were 13 Mughal rulers. But following Aurangzeb's death, the Mughal dynasty was on the decline, very definitely in the decline. But it lasted until 1857, until when Bahadur Shah Zafar was deposed by the British. The British established their kingdom after the Plassey War in Bengal in 1757. They were ruling from Calcutta. They shifted to Delhi in the 20th century beginning, I think 1916 or so. And they finally left in 47. This is our recent 1000-year-old history. So roughly about 500 years, 334 years of Sultanate rule, and then nearly about 200 years, a little less than that, of Mughal rule. That is 500 years. The ruler's paradigm was definitely Islamic. Subsequently, they had become weakened, but the kind of actions they did was sanctified by their paradigm, their religion. And India was at the receiving end. It is indeed very surprising that India has withstood this onslaught culturally, spiritually, politically, socially, and survived so much so that we are still alive, connecting to the Indian traditions and culture. Of course, the paradigm. I believe that the paradigm has a lot of strength, Indian paradigm. So it is the basic cause, basic source of strength, because of which it survived. Now let us look at what was the kind of Islamic rule that we had during the first 334 years. I take a few examples. These examples are selected examples. Somebody had questioned last time, why do you select only one type of examples? My purpose makes me select certain examples. It has a purpose. Purpose is to show that is a paradigm is working here. In 1186, the Ghuri, a Turkish tribe of Afghanistan, invaded India, captured the city of Delhi, destroyed its temples, confiscated its wealth, and settled down in its palaces to establish the Sultanate of Delhi. An alien despotism fastened upon northern India for 3 centuries and checked only by assassination and revolt. The first of these bloody sultans, Qutbuddin Aibak, was a normal specimen of his kind, fanatical, ferocious, and merciless. His gifts, as the Mohammedan historian tells us, were bestowed by hundreds of thousands, and his slaughters likewise were by hundreds of thousands. In one victory of this warrior, who had been purchased as a slave, 50,000 men came under the collar of slavery, and the plain became black as pitch with the blood of Hindus. Muhammad bin Tughlaq. I'm quoting from Will Durant. Will Durant, as an American historian, philosopher, he and his wife, Ariel Durant and Will Durant together, they wrote the book of Civilization. The first book, volume 1, it is a totally 12 volumes, but the first volume is about India, our Oriental heritage, that is titled. So from which I'm quoting this. Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq acquired the throne by murdering his father, surpassed his predecessors in bloodshed and brutality, fed the flesh of a rebel nephew to the rebel's wife and children, ruined the country with reckless inflation, and laid it waste with pillage and murder till the inhabitants fled to the jungle. He killed so many Hindus that, in the words of a Muslim historian, there was constantly in front of his royal pavilion and his civil court a mound of dead bodies and a heap of corpses. While the sweepers and executioners were weary out of their work of dragging the victim and putting them to death in crowds. The victims and putting them to death in crowds. Firoz Shah Tughlaq, his successor, Firoz Shah, invaded Bengal, offered a reward for every Hindu head, paid for 180,000 of them, raided Hindu villages for slaves, and died at the ripe age of 80. Sultan Ahmad Shah feasted for 3 days whenever the number of defenseless Hindus slain in his territories in one day reached 20,000. The Hindus had accepted the Zimmi status and the concomitant jizya tax in exchange for safety. But now they built idol temples in the city in defiance of the Prophet's law, which forbids such temples. Under divine leadership, I destroyed these buildings and killed the leaders of idolatry, and the common followers received physical chastisement until this abomination had been banned completely. This is what he writes. When Firoz heard that a pagan festival was going on, he reacted. My religious feelings exhorted me to finish off this scandal, this insult to Islam. On the day of the festival, I went there myself. I ordered the execution of the leaders and practitioners of this abomination. I destroyed their idol temples and built mosques in their places. Sultan Alauddin of Delhi, in the month of 1298 AD, his brother Malik Mizuddin and Nasrat Khan were sent to Cambay, the most celebrated of the cities of Hind in population and wealth. Cambay is south of Ahmedabad, with a view of holy war. Enlisted under their banners about 14,000 cavalry and 20,000 infantry. And when they arrived at the destination at early dawn, they surrounded Cambay, and the idolaters were awakened from their sleepy state of carelessness and were taken by surprise. The Mohammedan forces began to kill and slaughter on the right and on the left unmercifully throughout the impure land, and for the sake of Islam, and blood flowed in torrents. They plundered gold and silver to an extent greater than can be conceived, and an immense number of brilliant precious stones such as pearls, diamonds, rubies, emeralds, etc., as well as a great variety of cloths, both silk and cotton, stamped, embroidered, and colored. This quote is from Eliot and Dawson. Eliot and Dawson together wrote an 8-volume history of India. The title is History of India as told by its own historians. These accounts are actually taken from the court historians of these sultans. Alauddin Khilji had consulted the most learned Maulana of his time. The Qazi pronounced the correct position as follows about the Zimmi status. The Hindus are designated in the law as payers of tribute, kharaj, guzar. And when the revenue officer demands silver from them, they should without question and with all humility and respect tender gold. If the officer throws dirt into their mouths, they must without reluctance open their mouths wide to receive it. By these acts of degradation are shown to the extreme obedience of the Zimmi, the glorification of the true faith of Islam and the abasement of false faiths. Allah himself orders them to be humiliated, as he says, till they pay jizya with the hand and are humbled. The Prophet has commanded us to slay them, plunder them, and make them captive. No other religious authority except the great Imam Hanifa, whose faith we follow, has sanctioned the imposition of the jizya on Hindus. According to all other theologians, the rule of Hindus is either death or Islam. There are 4 judicial clans, schools of Sharia. One is Hanifa. Hanifa permits the imposition of jizya. The other 3 do not. They would give only 2 options, either death or Islam. The third option, because the rulers in Delhi invoked Hanifa's judicial system, the Hindus were allowed to survive. Amir Khusro says this, but for the kindness of Islam, Hindus would have been completely eliminated. Again, Will Durant, when one of his advisors protested against this policy, Alauddin answered, "O doctor, thou art a learned man, but thou hast no experience. I am an unlettered man, but I have a great deal. Be assured then that the Hindus will never become submissive and obedient unless they are reduced to poverty. I have therefore given orders that just sufficient shall be left to them from year to year of corn, milk, and curds, but that they shall not be allowed to accumulate any wealth in terms of gold or silver." The British also have followed this policy. The 150 years of British rule, actually it is 200 years, but when they gained control over the whole country by 1803, after that nearly about 144 years they ruled. One of their policies is to reduce the local populace to poverty. Another is to change their education system. Both paid them well. The usual policy of the sultans was clearly sketched by Alauddin, who required his advisor to draw up rules and regulations for grinding down the Hindus and for depriving them of that wealth and property which fosters disaffection and rebellion. Half of the gross produce of the soil was collected by the government. The native rulers used to take 1/6, that is 16%. Alauddin took 50%. No Hindu, says a Muslim historian, could hold up his head, and in their houses no sign of gold or silver or of any superfluity was to be seen. Blows, confinement in the stocks, imprisonment and chains were all employed to enforce payment. Imagine what kind of diffidence over a period of time it would instill in the psyche of the native population. It did. It did. Now take another example of Taimur. Taimur Lane is the 5th generation predecessor of Emperor Babur. He was from Samarkand and he invaded India in 1398 during the period of the Tughlaqs. When the Tughlaqs were not there, but he came to Delhi. Tughlaq, for a brief while, they had shifted to Devagiri. So he came to Delhi in 1398 and sacked the whole of Delhi, looted and returned. He is considered as one of the most cruel despots in human history. Look at his source of inspiration. About the year 800 Hijri, that is 1398, there arose in my mind, in my heart, the desire to lead an expedition against the infidels and become a Ghazi. Ghazi means the champion of the faith. There is one is Ghazi, another is Shahada. Ghazi is the one who kills infidels. Shahada is one who dies in the war with infidels. So he wanted to become a Ghazi, for it had reached my ears that the slayer of infidels is a champion, and that if he is slain, he becomes a martyr. It was for this reason that I formed my resolution, but I was undetermined in my mind whether I should direct my expedition against the infidels of China or against the infidels and polytheists of India. In this matter, I sought an omen from the Quran, and the verse to which I opened was this: O Prophet, make war upon infidels and unbelievers and treat them with severity. You can get this kind of verses in many places in Quran. Quran is about 6,000 surahs, 114 chapters. But if you look for the word jihad, it occurs, the explanation for jihad occurs scattered all over Quran in 164 places. So it is not a surprise that he opened some page and there he found this. But this clenched his decision. Make war and be severe. I said to them, he called his group of amirs, his subalterns, and said to them, my object in the invasion of Hindustan is to lead an expedition against the infidels, that according to the law of Muhammad, we may convert the people of that country to the true faith and purify the land itself from infidelity and polytheism, and that we may overthrow their temples and idols and become conquerors and crusaders before God. This comes right from the Bible, continues till Quran, and until Taimur Lang and after. His subordinates They gave an unwilling consent, but I place no reliance upon them. At this time, the wise men of Islam came before me and they declared that it is the duty of the Sultan of Islam and of all who profess that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is the Prophet of Allah. This is the kalima of Islam. So they quoted that and said that you are doing the right thing, all should comply with this. When the edifying words of the wise men reached the ears of the nobles, all their hearts were set upon a holy war in Hindustan. What is the motive he's recounting? Amir Sulaiman Shah and other Amirs said, so long as we and you should now order us to march against the infidels of Shivalik and rout and destroy them. I replied, my principal object in coming to Hindustan and in undergoing all this toil and hardship has been to accomplish two things. The first was to war with the infidels, the enemies of Mohammedan religion. And by this religious warfare to acquire some claim to reward in the life to come. That is paradise. The other was a worldly object, and that the army of Islam might gain something by plundering the wealth and valuables of the infidels. Plunder in war is as lawful as their mother's milk to Muslims who war for their faith, and the consuming of that which is lawful is a means of grace. It is not sin, and this sanction from the religion. Please note that Swatantraveer Savarkar had identified both these. A combination of this made Muhammad a formidable leader and Islam a formidable religion. Both worldly and unworldly. That is the paradise after death and paradise while living. Taimur informed the Hindus that he would exterminate them to a man unless they consented to submit unconditionally and become Muslims and repeat the creed. Many did not submit, and at Ajodhan, all the people of the fort were put to the sword. And in the course of 1 hour, the heads of 10,000 infidels were cut off. The sword of Islam was washed in the blood of infidels, and the treasures of the land became the spoil of my soldiers. They set fire to houses and reduced them to ashes, and they razed the buildings and the fort to the ground. This is commonplace. Now he reached Delhi, and there was no resistance in Delhi. And he captured many, 100,000 infidels, 1 lakh, impious idolaters, were on that day slain. Maulana Nasiruddin Umar, a counselor and a man of learning, who in all his life had never killed a sparrow, now in execution of my order, slew with his sword 15 idolater Hindus who were his captives. All these 100,000 people were unarmed, they had surrendered, and now even Maulanas will come and kill. On the great day of battle, these 100,000 prisoners could not be left with the baggage, and that it would be entirely opposed to the rules of war to set these idolaters and enemies of Islam at liberty. No other course remained but that of making them all food for the sword. Excepting the quarter of the Sayyids, the ulema and the other Muslims, the whole city was sacked. That was in the north. Now let us look at what happened in Vijayanagara. One second, there is a confusion. Okay. In Vijayanagara, by 1565, Vijayanagara was established by Harihara and Bukka under the leadership of Maharshi Vidyaranya in 1335. This Vijayanagara Empire succeeded very well until 1565, some 230 years. At the end of that, it had to face an end. Now I want you to see carefully the mistakes made by the Vijayanagara rulers. In 1565, this quotation is actually from Farishta, originally from Farishta, but was translated by John Briggs. History.
Can you make it tight?
Yeah. Originally Farishta was 1560 to 1640 or something. That is the kind of period. And he was not a witness to this, but he was only about 5 years old when these things happened. He was born in 1560, but he was in India. He was born in India. Later, Farishta wrote a lot about the history. So this is this is a quotation from his writing, Tariq-e Farishta. Ali Adil Shah, intent on adding to his dominions and repairing the losses sustained by his father, entered into a close alliance with Ramaraj. Ramaraj is Ramaraya. He is known as Aliya Ramaraya. He was the son-in-law of Krishnadevaraya. He doesn't belong to the main lineage of Tuluva dynasty, but he belongs to the Aravidu dynasty, which he founded. Okay. So this is Aliya Ramaraya. He was an old man at that time, entered into a close alliance with Ramaraya. And on the occasion of the death of a son of that prince, he had the boldness, attended only by 100 horses, to go to Vijayanagara to offer his condolences in person on that melancholy occasion. Ramaraya received him with the greatest respect, and the King Adil Shah with the kindest persuasions. King Adil Shah with the kindest persuasions prevailed upon him to lay aside his mourning. The wife of Ramaraya, Vijayanagara was founded in 1335 under the leadership of Maharshi Vidyaranya to establish Hindu Dharma, to protect Hindu Dharma. But by 1400 and odd, they were in great mood of Sarva Dharma Samabhav, and Muslims were given space to build a mosque in Hampi, and they were admitted to the army, to important positions in the army. You will see how important it was. And Hindus were ordered not to trouble them in their religious pursuits. Now, 1565, the king Ramaraya suffered a bereavement. His son died, and the neighboring Adil Shah, Ali Adil Shah, came to pay respects to him, say condolences to him, to Vijayanagar. Ali Adil Shah resolved to curb Ramaraya's insolence and one second. Yeah. Intent on adding to his dominions and repairing the losses sustained by his father, entered into a close alliance with Ramaraya. Notice that he wanted to add to his dominions, so he enters into a close alliance with Ramaraya. He wanted to actually accede Ramaraya's kingdom. And on the occasion of the death of a son of that prince, he had the boldness accompanied only by 100 horses to Vijayanagar and offer his condolence in person on that melancholy occasion. Ramaraya received him with the greatest respect, and the king Adil Shah, with the kindest persuasions, prevailed upon him to lay aside his mourning. The wife of Ramaraya, on this occasion, adopted the king as her son. At the end of 3 days, which were spent in an interchange of friendly professions and presents, Ali Adil Shah took his leave. Now he devises a plan. After putting Ramaraya to sleep, he devises a plan. Ali Adil Shah resolved to curb Ramaraya's insolence and reduce his power by a league of faithful against him. For which purpose, he convened an assembly of his friends and confidential advisors. Kishore Khan and Shah Abu Torab Shirazi represented that the king's desire to humble the pride of the Rai of Vijayanagar was undoubtedly a meritorious one and highly politic, but could never be effected unless by the union of all the Mohammedan kings of Deccan. As the revenues of Ramaraj, collected from 60 seaports, enabled him to maintain a force against which no single king of the Mussalmans could hope to contend with the smallest prospect of success. Ali Adil Shah commanded Kishore Khan to take measures to effect the object of a general league and to sound Ibrahim Qutub Shah and to open to him, if prudent, the designed plan. After some days, it was agreed that Hussein Nizam Shah, should give his daughter Chand Bibi in marriage to Ali Adil Shah with the fortress of Sholapur as her dowry. They had a contest between these two, Adil Shah and Nizam Shah. They had a contest about Sholapur port. So now the arrangement made is that they should ally in marriage and hand over Sholapur as her dowry, and that he should receive the sister of that prince named Huddiya Sultana as a consort for his eldest son Murtuza. That a treaty of eternal friendship should be entered on between both states, and that they should unite sincerely to reduce the power of Ramaraya. For which purpose it was resolved to march against him at the earliest. Hussein Nizam Shah, Ali Adil Shah, Ibrahim Qutub Shah, and Ali Perid Shah now began to make active preparations for the campaign against Ramaraya. In the year 1564, the four princes, at the head of their respective armies, met on the plains of Bijapur, and on the 20th of Jamad-e-ul-Awwal, that is December 26th of the same year, marched from that neighborhood. After some days, they arrived at Talikote and the armies encamped near the banks of the Krishna river. There was some waiting period. Ramarai collected his army and came to the other bank. His brothers, 3 armies from the side of Vijayanagar. But the river had to be crossed. And finally, these people crossed the river. And the battle took place on Tuesday, 23rd January 1565. The Vijayanagar army commenced attack in right earnest, and the right and left wings of the Confederate army were thrown into such a disorder that their commanders were almost prepared to retreat when the position was saved by Hussein, who opposed the enemy with great valor. The fighting was then continued, and the loss of life on both sides was heavy. But it did not last long, and the fate was determined by the desertion of 2 Mohammedan commanders under Ramaraj. Caesar Frederick, who visited Vijayanagara in 1567, that is 2 years after the war, said that each of these commanders had under him 70 to 80,000 men, and the defeat of Vijayanagara was due to their desertion. Ramaraja fell into the enemy's hands and was beheaded on the order of Hussein. The Hindus, according to custom, when they saw their chief destroyed, fled in the utmost disorder from the field and were pursued by the Elis with such success that the river was dyed red with their blood. It is computed by the best authorities that above 100,000 infidels were slain during the action and in pursuit. The plunder was so great that every private man in the elite army became rich in gold, jewels, tents, horses, and slaves, the kings permitting every person to retain what he acquired, reserving the elephants only for their own use. The kings themselves, shortly after the battle, marched onwards onto the country of Ramaraj, as far as Anegondi, and the advanced troops penetrated the Vijayanagar, which they plundered, razed the chief buildings to the ground, and committed every species of excess. It is said that this loot continued for 5 months. The third day saw the beginning of the end. The victorious Musalmans had halted on the field of battle for rest and refreshment, but now they had reached the capital, and from that time forward, for a space of 5 months, Vijayanagar knew no rest. The enemy had come to destroy, and they carried out their object relentlessly. They slaughtered the people without mercy, broke down the temples and palaces, and wreaked such a savage vengeance on the great stone-built temples and walls. Nothing now remains but a heap of ruins to mark the spot where once stately buildings stood. They demolished the statues and even succeeded breaking the limbs of the huge Narasimha monolith. Nothing seemed to escape them. This is the Narasimha monolith. See, the hands are cut. Lakshmi was supposed to sit on the left side. This is Ganesha. This is called Kadle Ganesha. It is like a Channa Kadle. It could not be broken easily, but some places they have broken it. But then they put fire on that. The whole stone split. This is Sasiva Ganesha. See the Sund. They broke up the pavilion standing on the huge platform from which the kings used to watch festivals and overthrow all the carved work. They lit huge fires in the magnificently decorated buildings, forming a temple of Vithala Swami near the river, and smashed its exquisite stone sculptures. With fire and sword, with crowbars and axes, they carried on day after day their work of destruction. Never perhaps in the history of the world has such a havoc been wrought. And wrought so suddenly, on so splendid a city, teeming with a wealthy and industrious population in the fun, plenitude of prosperity one day, and on the next seized, pillaged, and reduced to ruins amid scenes of savage massacre and horrors begging description. The loot must have been enormous. Couto states that amongst other treasures was found a diamond as large as hen's egg, which was kept by Adil Shah. This is a religious war. Otherwise, why should the stones, the idols, be destroyed? With meticulous planning, with great deliberation. Every new invader made his hills of Hindu skulls. That is known as Hindu Kush. Thus, the conquest of Afghanistan in the year 1000 was followed by the annihilation of Hindu population. The region is still called the Hindu Kush, Hindu slaughter. The Bahmani sultans in central India made a rule to kill 100,000 captives in a single day and many more on other occasions. The conquest of the Vijayanagara Empire in 1564 left the capital plus large areas of Karnataka depopulated. Let us look at the Mughal rule. With the sole exception of Akbar, the entire list of these sultans over these 500 years is the same story. Akbar, first 10-12 years continued the same tradition, but in later years, as he matured, he adopted a policy of compromise, coordination, and success. This is in his early years. When he attacked the Chittor, this is what happened, this is what he did. The breeze of the grace of Allah began to flow, began to blow. The heart of enemy began to writhe in pain. By the time of prayer, the full volume of sound was blown and delivered the final attack on the Satans. Realizing their helpless condition, that wretched race began to slaughter their women and children with their own hands and set fire to them, reducing them to ashes. The number of the dead was about 30,000. As a result of this victory, most of the persons of the army became rich, and under the emperor's government, they became men of substance. Everyone achieved the desired object. Everybody got in his army his cherished ambition. Men of sport enjoyed the beautiful ladies. Those who were covetous of holding property benefited themselves fully. Everyone was very happy over the success, and every soul got a fresh lease of life by this triumph. So Akbar issued a Fateh-Nama. Fateh means victory. So after the victory of Chittor, Akbar issued a Fateh-Nama from Ajmer. This was 1568. Akbar rose to power in 1556. This is 12 years after he ascended the throne. He asserts his commitment to jihad. In conformity with the happy injunction This is of the grace of my Lord, that he may try me whether I am grateful or ungrateful. We spend our precious time to the best of our ability in war and jihad. Ghiza means war against infidels. Ghazi means the one who conquers the infidels. And with the help of eternal Allah, who is the supporter of our ever-increasing empire, we are busy in subjugating the localities, habitations, forts, and towns which are under the possession of the infidels. May Allah forsake and annihilate all of them, and thus raising the standard of Islam everywhere and removing the darkness of polytheism and violent sins by the use of sword. We destroy the places of worship of idols in those places and other parts of India. The praise be to Allah who has guided us to this, and we should not have found the way had it not been that Allah had guided us. That's what the Quran says, that's what Akbar said. But in his later years, he changed his policy. A notable exception of these two types of sultans was Akbar. He saw through the exclusive claims of Islam and kept the ulema and the Sufis at an arm's length. He was favorably impressed by Hindu saints, sages, scholars, and statesmen, and became increasingly attached to them. He evolved a policy of Salah-e-Kul between the Islamic State and the Hindu society. He abolished jizya, banned cow slaughter, permitted questions regarding the character of Islam and its prophet, allowed Hindu converts to go back to their ancestral religion, and prohibited killing of Hindus for marrying Muslim women without getting converted to Islam. In short, he restored self-respect to the Hindus who came forward to help him in building a splendid and stable empire, which came to be envied by the rest of the world. Akbar's policy of peace came in for adverse review in the reign of Shah Jahan and underwent a total reversal under Aurangzeb. Actually, it was reviewed by Jahangir also. Now, Jahangir, it was reported, this is Jahangir's story. It was reported that many of the infidel and superstitious sects of Jains in Gujarat had made several very great and splendid temples. Emperor Jahangir ordered them to be banished from the country and their temples to be demolished. Their idols were thrown down on the uppermost step of the mosque, that it might be trodden upon by those who came to say their daily prayers there. This is Shah Jahan. Shah Jahan is considered to be a great synthesizer. According to Marxist historians, they call him a synthesizer. He synthesized the Hindu and Islamic cultures, they say. Because the Taj Mahal, which he is supposed to have built, shows symbols which are both Hindu and Islamic. Now, but the Badshah Nama, written by Mullah Abdul Hamid Lahori, his official court historian, says this about Shah Jahan. I mean, he was just recording the facts. It has been brought to the notice of His Majesty that during the late reign, that is Jahangir's reign, which is supposed to be a little weaker than Akbar and earlier Mughals. Late reign, many idol temples had been begun, but remained unfinished at Benares. About Gujarat, Jahangir himself had taken action. Now this is in Benares, the great stronghold of infidelity. The infidels were now desirous of completing them. His Majesty, the defender of the faith, gave orders that at Benares and throughout all its dominions, in every place, all temples that had been begun should be cast down. It was now reported from the province of Allahabad that 76 temples had been destroyed in the district of Benares. Muslim writers have made no secret of the fact that they had destroyed the temple. Here is what Aurangzeb's granddaughter wrote in 1707 in her Persian work. Keeping the triumph of Islam in view, devout Muslim rulers should keep all idolaters in subjection to Islam. Brook no laxity in the realization of jizya. Grant no exceptions to Hindu Rajas from dancing attendance on Eid days and waiting on foot outside mosques till the end of prayers, and keep in constant use for Friday and congregational prayers the mosque built up after demolishing the temples of idolatrous Hindus situated at Mathura, Benares, and Awadh. This is Francois Gauthier, a French Indian journalist who keeps writing currently. He had arranged an exhibition of the original documents, the court farmans, the court orders of Aurangzeb, collected from the Museum of Bikaner, and then made an exhibition of this. So this is an article written on the exhibits. In 1669, the middle of Aurangzeb's rule, a general order was issued, 1969, April 9th, for the demolition of temples and established schools of the Hindus, throughout the empire, and banning public worship. That is exhibit number 9 and 10. Soon after, the great temple of Keshavaraj was destroyed. Temple of Keshavaraj is Mathura. It was destroyed in January, February 1670. Exhibit number 12. And in its place, a lofty mosque was erected. The idols, the author of Alamgiri informs, were carried to Agra and buried under the steps of the mosque built by Begum Sahiba in order to be continually trodden upon. And the name of Mathura was changed to Islamabad. This is the actual farman of Aurangzeb. The Lord Cashier of the Faith, Cherisher of the Faith, learned that the provinces of Thatta, Multan, and especially Banaras, that is the west and the east, the Brahmin misbelievers used to teach their false books in their established schools, and their admirers and students, both Hindu and Muslim, used to come from great distances to these misguided men in order to acquire their vile learning. His Majesty, eager to establish Islam, issued orders to the governors of all provinces to demolish the schools and temples of infidels, and with the utmost urgency put down the teaching and the public practice of the religion of those unbelievers. Note that there was no university now. All universities were demolished, destroyed. During this last 1000 years, India did not have universities. This was followed by Aurangzeb's order to demolish the highly venerated temple of Vishwanath at Benares, exhibit number 11, Keshavaraj temple, and the Somanatha temple, exhibit number 14. In June 1681, orders were given for the demolition of the highly venerated Jagannath temple of Orissa, In September 1682, the famous Bindu Madhava temple in Banaras was also demolished as per the emperor's orders. As late as the 1st January 1705, we find him ordering that the temple of Pandarapur be demolished and the butchers of the camp be sent to slaughter cows in the temple precincts. He was camping in the south because he was battling the Hindus in the south. Last few years, he was in the south only, though his capital was Delhi or Agra, but he was camping in Aurangabad. And from there, he sends butchers to cut cows in the temple precincts. In obedience to the Quranic injunction, he reimposed jizya on the Hindus, 2nd April 1679, which had been abolished by Emperor Akbar in 1564. Ban on Atishbazi and restriction on Diwali in exhibit number 32. Ban on ziyarat and gathering of the Hindus at religious shrines. Another ban on their traveling in palakis or riding elephants and Arab Iraqi horses, as the Hindus should not carry themselves with the same dignity as the Muslims. But after Aurangzeb, the Mughal Empire started declining, and in 1739, Nadir Shah attacked Delhi, and the king was totally helpless. He could not do anything when Nadir Shah looted Delhi. Nadir Shah came, occupied Delhi, looted, did what is known as Qatl-e-Aam, that is a general mass murder, and then went back. He took the peacock throne and went back to Persia. This is 1763, around that. Ahmad Shah Abdali invaded India in 1757, maybe a little earlier also. Many incursions he done, I think starting from 46. 57, he made an incursion right up to Mathura. And 61 was the Battle of Panipat, which the Indian side lost. Now, this is the letter which he invites. The Muslim community is in a pitiable condition. This is a Sufi scholar, Shah Waliullah, saying. Muslim community is in a pitiable condition. All control of the machinery of the government is in the hands of the Hindus because they are the only people who are capable and industrious. Wealth and prosperity are concentrated in their hands, while the share of Muslims is nothing but poverty and misery. In the next session, I will show you a very similar statement by Muhammad Iqbal. That is done in 1930. Wealth and prosperity are concentrated in their hands, while the share of Muslims is nothing but poverty and misery. At this time, you are the only king who is powerful, far-sighted and capable, defeating the enemy forces. Certainly, it is incumbent upon you to march to India, destroy Maratha domination, and rescue weak and old Muslims from the clutches of non-Muslims. If Allah forbid, domination by infidels continue, Muslims will forget Islam and within a short time become such a nation that there will be nothing left to distinguish them from non-Muslims. A very similar letter was written by Muhammad Ali in the 1920s, inviting the Amir of Afghanistan to invade India for the same purpose. I'll show you in the next session. Ahmad Shah Abdali, whom Waliullah invited to invade to wipe out the Marathas and Jats, sacked Mathura in 1757. But the Jat peasantry was determined that it was over their corpses that the ravagers should enter the sacred capital of Brija, 8 miles north of Mathura. Jawahar Singh barred the invaders' path with less than 10,000 men and offered a desperate resistance on 28 February 1757. Notice that Jawahar Singh's men are not trained army. They were peasantry, but they were determined to the last man to resist this onslaught. From sunrise, the battle raged for 9 hours, and at the end of it, 10 to 12,000 infantry lay dead on the two sides taken together. The wounded were beyond count. Now, Abdali overcame the resistance and entered Mathura. The Hindu Bethlehem. Bethlehem is the name for the birthplace of Jesus. Now lay utterly prostrate before the invaders. Early at dawn on the first March, the Afghan cavalry burst into the unwalled and unsuspecting city of Mathura, and neither by their master's orders nor from the severe handling they received in yesterday's fight were they in a mood to show mercy. For 4 hours, there was an indiscriminate massacre and rape of the unresisting Hindu population. All of them non-combatants and many of them priests. Idols were broken and kicked about like polo balls by the Islamic heroes. Houses were demolished in search of the plunder and then wantonly set on fire. Glutted with the blood of 3,000 men, Sardar Jahan Khan laid a contribution of 1 lakh on what remained of the population and marched away from the smoking ruins the same night. When after the massacre, Ahmad Shah's troops marched onward from Mathura, Najib and his army remained there for 3 days, plundered much money and buried treasure, and carried off many beautiful females as captives. The blue waves of Jamuna gave eternal repose to such of her daughters as could flee to her outstretched arms. Some other happy women found a nearer escape from dishonor by death in their household wells. But for those of their sisters who survived, there was no escape from a fate worse than death. A Muslim eyewitness thus describes the scene in the ruined city a fortnight later. I am quoting from Jadunath Sarkar, who is an authority, he is a great historian of the last century. Said he, everywhere in the lanes and bazaars lay the headless trunks of the slain, and whole city was burning. Many buildings had been knocked down. The water of the Jamuna flowing past was of a yellowish color, as if polluted by blood. The man, a Muslim jeweler of the city, robbed of his all and fasting for several days, said that for 7 days following the general slaughter, the water had turned yellow. At the edge of the stream, I saw a number of huts of Bairagis and Sannyasis, in each of which lay a severed head with the head of a dead cow applied to its mouth and tied to it with a rope round its neck. Issuing from the ruins of Mathura, Jahan Khan roamed the country round and plundering everywhere as directed. Vrindavan, 7 miles north of Mathura, could not escape as its wealth was indicated by its many temples. Here, another general massacre was practiced upon the inoffensive monks of the most pacific order of Vishnu worshippers. As the same Mohammedan diarist records after a visit to Vrindavan, wherever you gazed, you beheld heaps of the slain. You could only pick your way with difficulty owing to the quantity of bodies lying about and the amount of blood spilt. At one place that we reached, we saw about 200 dead children lying in a heap. Not one of the dead bodies had a head. The stench and effluvium in the air were such that it was painful to open your mouth or even to draw breath. Now, this is what Will Durant says in general about the Mohammedan conquest of India is probably the bloodiest story in history. It is a discouraging tale, for its evident moral is that civilization is a precious thing whose delicate complex of order and liberty, culture and peace may at any time be overthrown by barbarians invading from without or multiplying within. Al-Biruni. Al-Biruni came on the chariot of Muhammad Ghazni around 1000 AD, and what Muhammad did, he has recorded, and this is what he says, and the consequence of that, consequence of what he did. Nasir Uddaulah Sabkatagin, that is Muhammad Ghazni. This prince chose the holy war as his calling. His son, Yamin Uddaulah Muhammad of Ghazni, marched into India during a period of 30 years and more. God be merciful to both father and son. Muhammad utterly ruined the prosperity of the country and performed their wonderful exploits, by which the Hindus became like atoms of dust, scattered in all directions. Their scattered remains cherish, of course, the most inveterate aversion of all the Muslims. This is the reason too why Hindu sciences have retired far away from those parts of the country conquered by us and have fled to places which our hand cannot be reached. The period that following this was a period of great distress and decadence for Indian culture. Not much of science grew at that time. No universities flourished at that time. And people with some dignity scattered away from the capitals. Nature of Islamic invasion, as Sitaram Goyal compiled from all that has happened in history, they kill the Brahmins and the cows, they violate the chastity of Hindu women, they demolish temples and desecrate the idols, they cut the tuft of hair on the head, shikha, and break the sacred threads. They circumcise people and make them eat beef, that is, convert people by force. They capture people, particularly women and children, and sell them into concubinage and slavery. They plunder people's properties and set fire to whatever they cannot carry away. My point is that all these are sanctified by the religion. Sitaram Goyal concluding it, I have already said it, so I will not. The dominant theme of these accounts of the Mu'mins, Muslims martyred, of Kafirs dispatched to hell, the cities and citadels sacked, The citizens massacred, Brahmins killed, forced to eat beef, temples razed, mosques razed in their sites, and idols broken, and their pieces taken to imperial headquarters for their to be for being trodden underfoot by the faithful on the steps of the main mosque. The booty captured and carried away. This I will do later. Sri N.S. Rajaram has written a book by name Nationalism and Distortions in Indian History. He says, here is one telling statistic that should give a true picture of the Islamic rule in India, beginning with the invasions of Muhammad Ghazni. The pre-Islamic India was renowned for its universities, great centers of learning like Nalanda, Vaishali, Saranath, Vikramashila, Takshashila, and many more. They attracted students from all over Asia and the world. Following the Islamic invasion of India, all these centers were destroyed. In the centuries following, during the next 800 years, not a single university was established by any Muslim ruler. This was a dark age, worse than what overtook Europe in the Middle Ages. Only in the last century or so, India is slowly coming out of this long, dark age. Schools still survived, but the schools were very small schools, many times housed in the house of the Guru. Such schools survived until 1800, until the British took over, and the British slammed on these schools and hit on the economic source of the schools. The schools collapsed. Otherwise, on an average, every village had a school. This is recounted in Sri Dharmapal's book on the beautiful tree, where he narrates, based on the British documents, their survey, the statistics, how many schools were there, how many people used to attend, how many years the children would spend in the school, how many subjects they would study, what is the quality of teachers, etc., are documented in the book. Jadunath Sarkar, a famous historian, reputed, well-known, learned historian, writes, the murder of infidels is counted as a merit in a Muslim. There is no doubt about this. It is said in 164 verses. It is not necessary that he should tame his own passions or mortify his flesh. There is no need for a self-restraint. The religion doesn't ask for that. It is not necessary for him to grow a rich growth of spirituality. There is no yoga. There is no self-restraint. There are only three things in these religions, in all the three of them. One is faith, faith in the jealous God. Another is prayer. Third is conversion. Get as many people as possible, convert them to Islam, convert them to Christianity. He has only to slay a certain class of his fellow beings to plunder their lands and wealth, and this act in itself would raise his soul to heaven. There is hadith. Hadith means secondary scriptures in Islam based on the observations and discussions with So based on the discussions or observations of the Prophet's life and his speech, things are documented in hadiths. One of the hadiths where the Prophet explains what is the difference between a Qazi and a normal mu'min, normal faithful and a Qazi. He says Qadi will be sent to heaven, which is the 100th level heaven, and the level between the heaven and the earth, between one heaven and another heaven, is as much as the distance between the earth and the heaven. it is sanctified, it is perpetuated throughout history. A religion whose followers are taught to regard robbery and murder as a religious duty is incompatible with the progress of mankind or with the peace of the world. This is historian of the last century saying that. When a class of men is publicly depressed and harassed, it merely contents itself with the dragging on an animal existence. The Hindus could not be expected to produce the utmost of what they were capable of. Amidst such social conditions, the human hand and the human mind cannot achieve their best. The human soul cannot soar to its highest pitch. So this was a dark age where not much of science grew, not much of sciences grew. Even though there are many domains where Indian genius has flourished, like music, literature, etc. But really, this was not a best period for India. The barrenness of the Hindu intellect is just one more bestowal of inheritance of Muslim rule in India, says Professor K.S. Lal, a historian. I would like to end by a more sobering quote from A.L. Bhasham. Bhasham was a British historian who has written books, The Wonder That Was India, a beautiful book about ancient India. So he says this after a deep study. Inequality of birth was given religious sanction in India, and the lot of the humble was generally hard. Yes. And yet our overall conclusion is that in no other part of the ancient world were the relations of man and of the man and the state so fair and humane. In no other early civilization who were slaves so few in number, in no other early civilizations were slaves so few in number, and in no other ancient law book are the rights so well protected as in the Arthashastra. No other ancient lawgiver proclaimed such noble ideals of fair play in battlefield as did Manu. In all our history of warfare, Hindu India has few tales to tell of cities put to the sword or of the massacre of non-combatants. To us, the most striking feature of ancient Indian civilization is its humanity. Thank you. Thank you for your patience. Questions I would like to.
Yes, Omkar, please.
Not audible. Not audible, Omkar.
Yes, please.
Yes.
Yeah. So I have a couple of questions. First one is one pattern which we saw throughout the history of the Islamic invasion is whenever the leader loses or whenever the leader dies or gets captured, we see a pattern of submitting or the pattern of surrender. And we see only difference. This has a difference with Shivaji and his successors. That the Mughal Maratha War, which lasted for 25-26 years, it saw the three kings dying, but still it continued. So this is in continuance with, like, there was one question in last session that what is why we take the name of Shivaji as in this matter, like, or why the Shivaji is more highlighted in this matter. So I see this as one reason. Maybe you can throw some more light on that. And second question is, yeah, can I ask the second question or we'll take it later?
Let me first respond to your first question. Your question, if I understand correctly, you say that if the leader is killed, people run away, as it happened in the case of Vijayanagar.
Correct. And we see this
Yeah.
pattern at many places.
Can all of us go on mute because it is echoing back?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So as it happened in the case of Vijayanagara, Ramaraya was killed and the army fled. This is a matter of organization, and probably it is a matter that was not given an adequate care, the second line of leadership. If you cultivate a second line of leadership, it will take over. Prepare yourself for eventuality. This is a minor matter in my opinion. It can be taken care if you prepare. So it is not a general trend, as you see. And you see, you yourself have quoted examples that in the case of Maratha warriors, it continued. Because there are so many people who are ready to take the charge. So this is a matter which the statesman should pay attention to, cultivating second line of leadership. It is not a major thing, what I say is. Major thing is the psyche. I have read somewhere that K.M. Munshi observes this, which is very true. Kannayalal Munshi. He says, in my humble study of history, I have seen the rise and fall of a nation is directly related to the common feeling of its army. Common collective feeling of its army. Not the exact words, but this is what it means. What pervades the army will decide. In India, the problem was that our whole society, our whole psyche was not identifying ourselves fully with India. It was fragmented. It is a fragmented polity that was easy for a conqueror to win. टुकड़े कर दो, टुकड़े टुकड़े करके खा जाएंगे. When Prithviraj was there were people who fought, but Jayachand was against that, right? And in 1761, what happened? I think one of the Confederate Army leaders walked away from the war front after going and joining there because of differences. He walked away. And what was the consequence? It was a total massacre. So India had this weakness. It is a political weakness. So that it is a question of psyche. See, wars are not conquered. See, one battle doesn't decide a war. In the Second World War, there were several times the Allies had fallen back. It is not a continuous, unremitting success. You heard of Dunkirk? When the Britain withdrew from the continent. So it is not always that you will have victories in battles. A war is not a battle. A battle is one encounter. A war is fought not between armies really. War is fought between nations or the psyche, the communities. Now, you see, Vietnam is a very small country, but America could not subjugate it. America had to withdraw shamefully. Though America was a superpower, because Vietnam was not willing to take it. In Afghanistan is nothing compared to Soviet Russia, but Soviet Russia invaded Afghanistan, occupied it, but after 12 years they withdrew because the country is not accepting them. It is a psyche that fights. It is not mere outcome of a battle or the smartness of a king. Of course, king has a great responsibility, but it is not only that. In our case, it is 600, 700 years of a warfare. An alien culture, if you can call it culture, was trying to invade, occupy the central place in you, and spit in your mouth. And India could not respond to it. It is a great thing that India survived this. It is because of something else. But India could have responded to it. It did not. Who sustained Akbar? So it is the fissures in the psyche that has caused this downfall. So it is very important to take notice of this and close up.
Okay.
That is my response to you. Please ask the second question.
Yeah. Second question is, if we see the Semitic religions, they see only one God, which is jealous, and there is no other God. In Semitic religions, they see only one God, only one faith.
Fine. Understood.
And in our paradigm, if you see, there are multiple, like there is no restriction.
Yeah.
So can we say that the single God or single faith gives the upper hand to these Semitic religions when it comes to keeping to the goals, keeping to the one goal, and it becomes scattered.
Yeah.
And it becomes scattered in case of Indian paradigm.
India did not fight for gods at all. It is not that. Point number one is that one jealous God, there is only one God, you said. It is not true. If he is jealous, he himself is perceiving the presence of other gods, right? Now this whole paradigm, which has combined paradise in the other's life, next life, and in the present life, loot. This has given a formidable force. And all the base things that you do in a war and a plunder is sanctified by religion. And you will go to heaven just for this reason. Not for not doing. If you do this, you will go to a higher heaven. 100 times higher heaven. It is this religious emotion together with the base emotions combined that gave Islam its strength. Our weakness was not multiple gods. Our weakness was a political weakness of not identifying with India as a whole, not recognizing the enemy. Too much indulgence in I am talking about the leadership, not about the common man. Too much indulgence in the good things of life. Not very hardworking. That was the problem. And jealousy, mutual jealousy. Jealousy is said to be the most dominant feeling of Kali Yuga in our tradition. And in the last 1,000 years, if you see minutely how these leaders operated, I'm talking about the kings. Jealousy was at most prominent in their hearts. Jealousy means what? Unable to put up the rise of another person nearby. It is the cause of downfall, as I see it. I don't see multiple gods. It is such a wonderful idea, yeah, multiple gods.
Actually, sir, the point was multiple goals for the leaders.
No, we didn't have multiple goals at all.
Example I can give is during Panipat battle. So whoever ran away, for example, any king from any region ran away from the battle or before the battle, he had a different political goal of acquiring Delhi.
That is right. On the other hand, that was a political goal. It was a personal goal. That is the cause of division. I agree.
Okay.
When you said one God is not the cause. Cause is one goal there, right?
Okay.
gold, paradise, and the plunder.
Okay. We'll go to the next question. Omkar, please.
Yeah.
Give chance
Yeah.
to others. Thank you.
Yes, yes.
Next is Prabhat, please.
Yeah. So my question, sir, is that you were mentioning right from 1000 AD onwards, when the continuous attack, onslaught, and plunder and loot was happening, and then what I saw in 1761, right? This person wrote a letter to Abdali, and still, it is mentioned that still a lot of things, or most of the wealth were still in the control of Hindus, were a little bit conflicting to me. That how come we could still retain so much wealth and power in the society after 800 years of onslaught? I was not able to understand. I thought our situation would be much more pitiable by that time.
All I can say is India is a rich land. And India has a genius. Left to himself, Indian genius flourishes very well. So if you take away from his hand, he will generate further wealth. So all that I can say is that India is a rich land, and that's why it attracted so many invaders. Yeah, that's all that I can say.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Next is Bharat, please. Bharat Pathak.
Namaste, sir.
Namaste.
So my question is, I was reading this book, Muslim State in India by K.S. Lal. And in that, I just wanted to go to the Vijayanagar Empire. And I think today also I posted in the group saying that the king placed Quran to be placed before his throne on the rich desk. And the policy continued throughout the thing under Krishna Dev Rai till 1530. So, I mean, why this kings, right? I mean, they're ruling such a big state. And even after that, they fail to understand the psyche of the Islamic invaders. And this is happening in 1500 time frame, wherein already they have a history of around 700 years, what has happened throughout the nation. So wasn't there anybody to teach them that they are doing some grave mistakes?
That is the pity, Bharat. Even now, and in the next session, I'll show you what happened during the freedom movement. The people who are in a commanding position who should educate have abdicated their duties. It is, I will place the blame squarely on the leadership of the society, whatever that would mean. It is intellectual leadership or it is political leadership. It is the task of the leadership to find out what kind of people you are surrounded with. You cannot afford to be naive. Look at Ramaraya. What did he do? He was so naive. He did not know that a scheme was flourishing, a design was planned, a plan was designed, and it is flourishing under his nose. His own commanders were contacted, and he did not know. And they are not ordinary commanders. They were commanders of 70,000 plus. And they gave a hand at the right moment. Kings have to be astute. They should have the network through which they should elicit what is your neighbor thinking. This has been told in Arthashastra. This has been demonstrated by Krishna in Mahabharata. But
so,
I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know. Yeah. I don't know why.
Repeatedly, we see the same pattern happening throughout 1200 years or 1400.
Not learning at all. Not learning from history.
Mm-hmm.
Even now, even now, It is the same state. Yeah. Barring, see, this Voice of India, people have brought out some books on that. Before that, it was assumed that we can prevent partition, we can prevent this. It was inexorable. And the methods that he adopted to bring them together, it just not work. People didn't understand this at all. If you wanted to bring them together, keep the country together, you should have been prepared for that. It was totally unprepared. In fact, partition is one of the greatest holocausts in human history. 1.45 crores of people changed their locations. Migration, transfer, 1.45 crores. About 10% of them died in transit. 14 lakhs of people.
Yeah.
And even 1 month earlier to partition, nobody anticipated this. Look at the level of ignorance. That is why I say that this ignorance is the culprit. We have to learn deep down. Very unfortunate. Yeah, very unfortunate, but true. Yeah.
Dhanyavad, sir. Pranam.
Next is Ravish.
Namaste, sir. I think
Namaste.
I think this will be a repetition of Bharat's question, but I guess so. At the core of our spiritual paradigm, it is clearly said that jealousy is one of the worst things that a person can pursue.
Yeah.
And it is said in multiple places, even in Gita, and we can hear Swami Paramarthanandji expressing that at multiple places as well. But again, coming back to the same point, I think when even before all of this happened, when the Indian society was very well accustomed to our culture, even at that time, this jealousy existed, right? I mean, is this just a human nature, or why? I mean, basically trying to understand why it prevailed even after such a backing from the actual spiritual paradigm.
Yeah. Why these ups and downs in our society? This is your question. In spite of the fact that you have a very good knowledge base, philosophy, spirituality, etc., why did we decline? Right? I really do not know an answer to this. Nations rise and nations fall. And I don't think anybody has a very clear answer to this. For example, the British nation, it rose, its rise started from something like 1500. And then it rose. It created a defense, that is not defense, an offense force, its navy. It started ruling the whole world. By the 19th century, they were the masters in the world. Their empire, where the sun would never set, it is said. But by the beginning of the 20th century, the British power was on the decline. And they saw that many of them have seen that their power is declining, but they could not arrest it. In fact, George Orwell makes an observation that by the beginning of the 20th century, the British middle class was so barren, he says. The middle class was less useful to society than the fleece to a dog, he says. He said the British leadership is second rate. He calls them stuffed shirts. Why did this decline happen? We don't know. But decline happened. And by 1914, it was clear that they are not the leaders. It is America which is the leader. By 1947, 45, it is very clear that Britain is no more going to be the ruler of waves. Their empire broke. they gave us freedom in 1947, they felt compelled to give it. They not only gave India freedom, they also gave it to Burma, they gave it to Sri Lanka, they gave it to Israel. They wound up their colonies because they could not sustain. See, today England is a third prominent country in Europe, not the first. They could not arrest it. Why did this happen? We don't know. It rose. 18th, 19th century, it became very prominent and it declined. So our country declined during the last 1,000 years. Let us acknowledge that. But it is on the rise now. Hope that it will last another 10,000 years. Everything is a very long scale, very large scale. So let us hope that.
Yeah, I remember you're saying that Sri Aurobindo says even nations have karma, so maybe.
Okay. Okay, Ravish, we'll go to the next question. Next one is from Anand.
Namaste, Sirji.
Namaste.
My question is, have you studied people like, I want to understand people like Audrey Trusch, as you know, she's written a book on Aurangzeb, and actually I had communicated with her before during the Taj Mahal thing, but I have not read the book, but I have heard a lot of things about it. But obviously she has certain motivation. So have you tried to study as to what is the thing that motivates people like her? I mean, she's very young and not, we wouldn't say she's from the old school or something. So why would she try to kind of whitewash this Aurangzeb thing, I guess?
I don't know. I have not studied that. I don't know.
Okay.
Okay. Next question from Praveen.
Hello, Ji. I actually put the question in the chat also. See, I think, we've been taught that, India has never conquered any other country in the history. We are such kind of a great nation and so on. But Cholas and they've conquered Cambodia, Vietnam, almost Indonesia. The whole, when we talk about Akhanda Bharat, that whole piece of South, the southeastern is all conquered by our own folks. So is it inaccurate to say that India did not conquer? Because we had conquered Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Singapore, all of it we had conquered. Second thing is, when we conquered these countries, did we not enforce Hinduism? Otherwise, why will you find so many temples, so many Hindu places of worship in these countries? Thank you, Subarnaji.
Yeah. India's conquest has been cultural. This is what we say. India sent pilgrims to China. India sent probably to the Cambodia, Vietnam, and other places also. And they were welcomed there, they were accepted there. Probably they found it very attractive because it has a culture, it has a philosophy, and naturally it has an influence. Whether it is enforced, I would not agree that there is an enforcement of Hinduism, because Hinduism doesn't believe in enforcing. Its fundamental value is different. It would say that you do your work as you want to do. Yo yahamyam tanum bhaktya shraddhayarchitum ichchati tasya tasyas chalam shraddham tameva vidadhamyaham. This is what Bhagavad Gita says. In whichever form you want to worship, in that very form I strengthen your faith. And whatever you worship, like that you will become. If you want to become like me, you should worship me. But if you worship others also, it is my own manifestation, but with certain characteristic, and if you worship that, you will become like that. And I have no quarrels on that. So this is the Vedic viewpoint. Therefore, enforcing Hinduism is not there. But if they want to adopt, yes, why not?
But
if they recognize that there is a philosophy, why not? Now, whether the Cambodia or these things, if you are only making guessworks, we don't know. We'll just leave it at that. We don't know what kind of invasions there were. I would certainly say cultural invasion.
Yeah. Thank you, Ji. I mean, Rajaraja Chola had extended his empire all the way beyond Ganga. He was called as Gangai Konda Cholapura, and I think he had his territory there. That was my question. So we had also conquered emperors.
Praveen, only one point I would like to add here is invasion that India did, it is more of a military conquering. It is not plunder. It is not looting.
Okay. Got it. Yeah, I think
any kind of a warfare is confined to the warfield. It is for the first time that you see what kind of things happened in Mathura. Mathura, there is a graphic description, so it becomes very touchy. But this was the case throughout the Sultanate period. Throughout. If there is a festival, then people will descend on that. Lift the girls and go.
Correct.
So that kind of invasion, that kind of what do you call the devastation, that kind of sacrilege, India never did.
The common man were not affected. The war used to happen between the.
If there is a war, there is a war between the king, according to the norms of the warfare. When I say this, don't put one single example and say, okay, here is an exception. There may be exceptions to that. See, when you're talking about the culture and other things, you have to look at the whole community and the whole history. One exception here and there may be there, but that is not to be counted as representative of the whole culture.
Okay. Next question is from Professor Nandi.
Sir, Vaishali here.
Vaishali.
Sir, amidst such barbaric, barbaric ruling by Muslims for so many years, what voice? Sir, can you hear properly now? Amidst such barbaric ruling by Muslims for so many years, what was the impact on education? I repeat, amidst such barbaric ruling by Muslims for so many years, what would have been the impact on education? Obviously, there must have been some adverse effect. So, what was that impact?
Yeah,
Hello, sir?
I mentioned. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah. May I answer? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I mentioned it during the last leg of my session.
Yeah.
The universities were destroyed.
Yeah, yes, sir. I would like to know more about it.
Yeah. We will have more about this in another session.
Okay.
What kind of education survived? Education survived at a lower level. It survived at a lower level, but it did not survive as universities.
Yeah.
Higher education did not survive much.
Yeah. Okay, at individual level, you mean to say?
At a local level, you can say. Maybe a village is to sustain a school type of things.
Okay.
But even those schools did not sustain after the British took over.
Yeah, that is that.
Yeah.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Next, please.
Next is Abhijit, please.
Hello, namaste, sir. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Sir, I just wanted to add that before I ask a question, today is coincidentally the founding day of Vijayanagara Empire in 1336. And it was indeed a delight to hear about Vijayanagara Empire from you, being the person who hails from Hampi and Hospet from Vijayanagara Empire. And coming to my question now, the first question is, as my current study requires me to go through ancient history, medieval history, and modern history, the NCERTs which I study are mostly written by Marxist historians like Romila Thapar, in which it says that the thing we are opposing now about cow slaughter, it was very much practiced by the Vedics in the ancient period, and indeed it was considered as holy and pure, and it was even offered to the guests who would come to their home. So I tried to look upon this and tried to do my own research, but I would often be getting leading to the same Marxist historians who wrote that. Coming to the second point, whenever I read other historians like Robert Sewell, who were British civil servants who documented history from earlier historians like Farishta, and when I show these instances of slaughter, what the Marxist historians try to debate is that these historians tried, since they were colonialists, they tried to manipulate and bring in a divide between Hindu and Muslims to break the unity among India, and hence such history was manipulated and written. So what should I, so again, adding to that, my first question is, since I don't have very much knowledge in Vedas, is there a provision for cow slaughter and eating cow meat in the Vedas? And two, should we compromise upon the actuality or the factuality of history only to maintain harmony or some sort of secularism? Thank you, sir.
My limited study of Veda doesn't talk about cow slaughter there, one thing. And these Marxist historians, when they say cow slaughter, what are they trying to say? Suppose it was there. What are they trying to say? You should do it now. A large body of the society for the last 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 3,000 years has abjured cow slaughter and start treating it as holy, as endeared animal. We have a long history. In the history, we have changed certain things. So what? What are your problem that Vedic, some verse here and there, they will pick and say that, oh, cow meat was given. Why should I take your authority on that? Who are they to tell us? Even if it is true, why should it be now? So I don't accept this kind of argument of Marxist historians. Their whole purpose is to demolish your Shraddha in your scriptures. That is their purpose. They write, we will have a separate session on this. They write on the basis of a Marxist theory propounded in the 1850s, 1840s, 1850s. Marx has said certain things about the Indian society. Today's Marxist historians write only on the light of what Marx has said, trying to make what Marx has said to be true. They interpret our history in that light. So we will have a separate session on that.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
They don't give proof. They will say, see, if you say holy, they will say it was not holy. Your forefathers have eaten. If anybody says that this is what the Vedas say, you should go and ask them, please show me where it is.
Okay, sir, with that we come to the end of the session. Thanks everyone. Let us end the session with Shanti Mantra. Sir, okay.
Om Shanti.
Thank you everyone for attending the session.